I've heard several people talking about the change of seasons. It seems like people are a little excited about maybe fall coming. Maybe not so much winter for some, but others talking about the fall and the crisp air and starting to talk that way. It's because we feel a little bit of difference already, and we see things happening, and just it's getting very close to that time where there's going to be changes. I noticed even just walking by this morning, we've just got a couple of tomato plants in a straw bale out there, and I'm beginning to think now, instead of waiting for the tomatoes to ripen, early on you wouldn't even dream of doing this, but I'm thinking at this point about maybe picking a green or two and frying it up, because they're not all going to ripen probably, and so you start thinking different with change of seasons, don't you? I mean, in spring you're not going to pick green tomatoes. I mean, not in general. You don't want to pick those because you want those to last. They're going to ripen. So you start thinking different, just with changes of seasons coming along. And so, I was walking through the hall, and I heard two or three people talking about ready for the leaves to start changing and things like that. And I had noticed that earlier on, that people seem ready for that. And it's kind of interesting. Others, I mean, is there anybody that just really is dreading fall? All right, there's a hand. There's a hand or two. But not very many. How many are looking forward to fall? All right, look at the hands. So you guys are a minority that are not looking forward to it. But we seem to be ready for that change. Sometimes in life, we're not ready for change. We're not ready for the change of seasons. And regardless, I mean, there is nothing you can do to stop those changes from happening, changes in life, various things that happen within our lives. Solomon, being given the wisdom that he was, wiser than the other man, God blessing him with that, he was asking for that wisdom to be able to lead God's people. He was a young guy. He was now becoming king. His father David was gone, and he was wanting wisdom. God blessed him with riches and wisdom beyond anybody else. And in Ecclesiastes, if you want to turn back there, it's chapter 3, and it's very, very familiar, whether that is to some because back in the 60s somebody put it in song form, or if it's simply because you read it within Scripture, heard it preached, or studied in classes, and that type of thing. But I want to read it, just this first part of chapter 3 of Ecclesiastes. There is a time for everything, and a season for every activity under heaven. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to uproot. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to tear down and a time to build. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to scatter stones and a time to gather them. A time to embrace and a time to refrain. A time to assert and a time to give up. A time to keep and a time to throw away. A time to tear and a time to mend. A time to be silent and a time to speak. A time to love and a time to hate. A time for war and a time for peace. It's interesting going into this that there is a season for every activity under heaven. And he starts talking about these times. And we know in life, I mean, just as we experience life together, that there are seasons of life. I mean, there are times when you're young and there's a lot of energy. It doesn't hurt as much you fall than maybe you hear other people talking. When you're a little kid, and you watch these kids running around here, or I watch my grandkids, and man, they can fall and fall hard, and just get right back up and take off. There's not as much weight there. There's flexibility and all of that, and it's a season of life that is really neat. I mean, that they can experience that, but then you start reaching a point where it hurts a lot more when you fall, and then you don't want to run and jump on the homemade water slide as hard as they run and jump on the homemade water slide, because they can just zoom right down it. But then there also comes a time that if you fall, it's very possible something might break, and happen much easier than it does when you're younger. And so those are some seasons of life. We find seasons of life that happen sometimes because of our health. Sometimes when various things happen. Sometimes it's because other circumstances happen around us. Maybe we lose a job. Maybe we change schools. I mean, there's all kinds of things that can happen within our lives that basically put us into another season. They are changes that happen to us. In some cases, maybe it's losing a loved one, and life around us changes. And so we look at this passage, and it's saying there's a time for everything. And understanding that, and even as Solomon and experiences that he had, and really he's writing Ecclesiastes from experience. It's not early on when he received wisdom. It's after he has even been through some things. And so you see experience that starts coming out, and even some despair that starts coming out. I mean, through all of this. But he ends this thought up. I mean, as you go through Ecclesiastes and you see the ups and the downs, and really a lot of downs, but he ends it up that the whole duty of man is to fear God and keep his commandments, is how he winds that whole thing up. I mean, understanding, even he's coming from the first part of it here, there is a time for everything. So how do we deal with this? I mean, we look at others and some of the things that they had to deal with. If we were to look in Genesis, I mean, just the beginning of things and God's covenant with mankind that he made with Abraham. When he made it, it was Abram. And it's interesting because you find that Abram, in Genesis, latter part of Genesis chapter 11, he leaves Ur of the Chaldees with Terah, his father, and they're headed for the land of Canaan. They get to Haran, and as far as they get, and they stay there. And that's where his father dies. And so they've made a home there, and that's where they're living. And God speaks to Abram, and he tells him, I want you to get up, and I want you to leave, and go to a place that I will show you. And take your wife with you. You leave, you go. And he ends up taking his nephew with as well, and there's others that go with him. I mean, there's servants and the other people go along. But it's interesting because God doesn't tell him where he's going. That's quite a deal, isn't it? I mean, it's get up and go. I want you to leave, and I'll show you when you get there. I'll show you what I'm talking about. And so he leaves. Now, interestingly enough, the place that God leads him to, and that he takes him and he says, so you see all this? This will belong to your descendants. This is what I'm promising you. And guess where it was? It was the land of Canaan, where they had set out for to begin with. That's where he was going with his father. And God is saying, I'm going to give this to you. Now, there's a lot that happens with that. A lot that is interesting to see how God changes things within Abram's life. I mean, the promises that happen from there, that he is, because at this point, Abram doesn't have any descendants. I mean, he doesn't have a child. And so is he going to have any descendants? And he starts thinking, the top man that works in the house, his top servant, and he's thinking along that line. God says, no, I'm going to have a son. He tries to make it happen, and Sarah, his wife, being a part of that with a handmaid, and Ishmael is born. No, that's not the son I promised you. I said Sarah would have a son. And so sure enough, she does. And so we see Isaac and see changes that happen within Abraham's lifetime of his covenant with God. A promise of a people, but not just a people, a promise of blessing all nations, all families through his offspring. We find in the New Testament that's ultimately Jesus. In Galatians chapter 4 it says Jesus is that seed. Jesus is that promise. And so all the families of the earth are blessed through him. You see this fulfillment way back then. But it took changes in Abram's life and faith in Abram that he was willing to leave where he was living, where his father had established home. He was willing to leave all that and go to a place that God was going to tell him. And so through that faith, God blessed him. Now, it's interesting because you start looking at the family line. Of course, to Isaac then was born Jacob and Esau. And you see the turmoil that's there in the house because, Isaac loves Esau more, and his wife Rebekah loves Jacob more. And you see this struggle going on in the house. And Rebekah helps, Jacob the birthright, even though Esau was actual firstborn. And so Jacob gets the birthright, and he ends up having to flee because Esau wants to kill him by the time all this happens. And so he flees, and he ends up getting married and serves underneath a man. Actually, he gets married twice, but he serves underneath Laban, first for 7 years for one daughter, and then another 7 years the other daughter, because that's the one he really wanted to begin with. Really weird circumstances of what's going on in his life, but you see him maturing and God blessing him to where he says, it's time. I need to make amends with my brother. I need to go back home. And he does. And it's during that time, you've heard of Jacob's ladder. You've heard of Jacob wrestling with God. I mean, you see this happening with him, that Jacob really is wrestling. He's coming to a point to say, I'm no longer going to be the deceiver. I'm not going to be the person. I need to make things right. And he does. And he makes things right with his brother. And they come together. They embrace. And so there was a time for being within Jacob's life, even for him to come to this point, to become the patriarch that he was to be. Changes in his life. Totally different circumstances from one time to another. Because ultimately he ends up having these 12 sons. And one of them, his name's Joseph, and man, does he love Joseph. And that causes a problem. Because he loves Joseph more than he loves the rest of them. And Joseph, starts telling, God is giving him some dreams, and he starts telling the dreams. His brothers are already mad at him. He's got a special coat from his dad, and they're already mad at him. And they end up, putting him in a pit. A plan to kill him. One of the brothers saves him. Says, no, just put him in the pit. And there's a caravan comes along. They sell him. They sell their brother, and he's carried off into Egypt. They tell Jacob, his dad, he died. He hears it's got blood on it, and they put some blood on it. I mean, strange, horrible things that are happening here's Joseph. He was growing up, he was favored, he had it made. He had a good life. He had this coat of many colors. It was special, and he was growing up, and things looked very, very good for Joseph. And all of a sudden, his brothers are trying to kill him, and then they kill him, and he goes off a slave. You talk about a change in life, a change of seasons, but he serves, and he serves well, and he's really good at what he does. He ends up running the household, and then the wife of the man that he's working for makes an accusation because she really wants him, and she makes an accusation against him when he refuses her, and so then he no longer is the slave. Now he's in prison. He starts doing things right there, and he ends up pretty much running the prison as a prisoner. He's top guy. Ends up coming out because of God blessing him with the ability to explain some dreams and those kind of things, and he comes out. He ends up being second in charge over the land underneath Pharaoh. Change of seasons completely. He just hung on, and God blessed him. There was faith involved with that. Those some of the ones that we can look in Scripture, that we can see change of seasons. I mentioned during communion time, can you imagine the changes for Jesus? I don't think we can. I don't think we can grasp what it is to be Jesus. And the changes in coming here. And the willingness to do that. So with us, when things change, sometimes it's not welcome changes on our part. It's not things that we want to face. It's not something that we want to deal with. It's not something that we want to be a permanent change in our life. We would rather go back to the way it was, when often we realize there is no going back. But that doesn't mean that we cannot look forward. It doesn't mean that we cannot have a hope for something that is even greater. In Philippians chapter 4, I want to read this over here. Philippians chapter 4. Paul makes a statement, and Paul comes from, of course, being inspired to write these things down, but he's also coming from experience, and he's also endured a lot of things, and he's had changes in life. And he's addressing that to some point, because these people are, they're worried about Paul. Paul has written them this letter, and it's an encouraging letter. Philippians is one of those really encouraging, and he's written the letter to them, wanting them to understand, you don't have to be worried about me. You don't have to be concerned about me. And it's in Philippians chapter 4, and I might read just a little bit. Let's read verse 10. And just go through verse 13. And verse 11 is really when it starts what Paul is saying as far as accepting this. He says in verse 10, Philippians chapter 4, I rejoice greatly in the Lord that at last you have renewed your concern for me. Indeed, you have been concerned, but you had no opportunity to show it. I'm not saying this because I am in need, for I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. And then he's the secret. I can do everything through him who gives me strength. Whether it's in sickness, whether it's in health. I mean, you could quote those vows that Tim and Haley went through yesterday. For richer or for poorer. Whatever circumstances that Paul was finding himself in life, he had found a way to be content regardless. I can do everything through him who gives me strength. There are some things that are unchanging. There's several passages. Psalm 114, verses 8 and 9, the word of God abides forever. As well as Isaiah chapter 40, verse 8. While we're here in the New Testament, turn to Hebrews 13. We'll see a way to say this. If you all come up, you can. Passage, and you probably quote it. Sometimes it helps just to look as a reminder. But Jesus Christ, the same yesterday, today, and forever. Jesus doesn't change regardless of the circumstances that he has put himself in. He loves you. He has died for you. Just because seasons change doesn't mean that we have to change. There are opportunities for us to change in ways we need to. But if you have a faith in Jesus Christ, your hope is in him, and everything is good in life right now, everything going your way, then when something happens, when something takes place, everything isn't going your way, or it's not the way that you would choose it, it doesn't have to change your faith in Jesus Christ. He stays the same. And our faith in him can be the same. But it may be that you're in the midst of that right now. That there is major change for you, and it's not something you chose. You may be in major change right now, or getting prepared for major change right now, and it is something you chose. Don't let it have an effect on your faith in Jesus Christ. He stays the same. He's still there. He's still providing. He still loves. Because there's a change right now, but there's going to be changes coming later on. Because there is a time for everything. So hang in there. If you need to respond to this in any way, putting your faith in Jesus Christ, come stand and sing.